They fed her scraps from the table she set for everyone else and called it gratitude. Virginia 1816. The grandest harvest gathering Kingsley Plantation had ever seen. 40 wealthy families, merchants, landowners, every powerful man in 3 counties competing for Oliver Kingsley's attention. Then a servant placed a plain apple tart before the richest man in the room. One bite. Oliver Kingsley set down his fork. The entire hall went silent. Not because the music stopped, because the most powerful man in the county had gone completely, utterly still over a tart made by a widow nobody had bothered to thank. If you've ever been the woman who gave everything and got nothing back, stay with us. Subscribe and never miss a story about a woman who was always worth more than the world bothered to notice. The apple tart arrived on a plain white plate, no garnish. No ribbon, no flourish of any kind. The crust was crimped unevenly along one edge where someone had pressed too hard, and the filling had bubbled up through a small crack near the center, leaving a dark amber stain that no proper kitchen would have allowed past perfection. The sliced apples beneath the glaze were not arranged in the precise overlapping fan that Chef Beaumont prided himself on. They were simply placed, honestly, without pretense. Oliver Kingsley looked at it the way he looked at most things that arrived on his table at Hartwell Hall, with polite indifference. He had eaten desserts prepared by trained French pastry chefs in Charleston. He had tasted sugar sculptures in Richmond that took 3 men 2 full days to construct. Last spring in Philadelphia, a confectioner had presented him with a spun sugar replica of Independence Hall filled with preserved cherries soaked in brandy. And Oliver had eaten exactly 1 bite before setting down his spoon and returning to the conversation at hand. He had stopped expecting food to conscious him around the same time he had stopped expecting people to surprise him. Which was to say some years ago now. His fork touched the edge of the tart. He cut through the crust. The sound it made, that soft, yielding resistance, the way it broke cleanly without crumbling, made him pause for just a half second before he brought the first bite to his mouth. He chewed once, twice, then he stopped, not in the polite, performative way of a man composing a compliment. Not the calculated pause of someone about to offer praise for the sake of social grace. Oliver Kingsley stopped because something happened inside his chest that he had no prepared language for. He was 9 years old. He was standing in his mother's kitchen in the early morning before the house had woken, and the whole room smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon and something warm and sweet that meant everything was safe. His mother's hands were dusted white. She was humming something low and tuneless, and she didn't know he was watching her from the doorway. The apples in the pan were the ones they'd picked together from the old tree at the back of the property, the gnarled one his father had always said was past its prime, but that produced every single year without fail the most extraordinary fruit. Oliver set his fork down. He set it down very carefully, as a man sets down something fragile that he is afraid to break. The hall around him was enormous and full of noise. 40-some guests talking and laughing and competing for his notice in the practiced, exhausting way of people who needed something from him. Candles burning along the length of 3 mahogany tables. The smell of roasted pork and good tobacco and the particular expensive perfume favored by Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth, who had positioned herself deliberately at his left elbow since the beginning of the second course and had been maintaining a steady, cheerful monologue about her daughter's musical accomplishments for the better part of 20 minutes. Oliver heard none of it. Who made this? His voice cut through the noise without effort. Not because he raised it, but because Oliver Kingsley had the particular quality of certain men that when they spoke, rooms listened. It was not arrogance precisely, it was simply the accumulated weight of 38 years of being the person whose words settled matters. Mrs. Forsyth's monologue stopped mid-sentence. Conversation along the table died in ripples, the way sound dies when a stone drops into still water. James Whitmore, Oliver's house steward, appeared at his shoulder with the quiet precision of a man who had spent 15 years anticipating exactly this kind of moment. "Sir, this tart." Oliver didn't look up from the plate. "Who made it?" A pause. A very slight pause, but Oliver had learned to read pauses the way other men read ledgers. The James straightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe it was submitted as part of the charitable contributions for the evening, sir. Several families from the surrounding farms contributed dishes for the... I did not ask where it came from." Oliver looked up then. "I asked who made it." James met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then his gaze moved just slightly, just briefly to somewhere across the room. Oliver followed it. She was standing near the far wall, in the space between the kitchen passage and the edge of the hall, where the candlelight thinned out and the shadows gathered. She was not a servant, she wasn't wearing the household uniform, and she carried herself with a particular kind of stillness that was different from the careful blankness trained domestic staff learned to inhabit. But she was not a guest either. She had the look of a woman who had learned, through long practice, to occupy the edges of rooms without calling attention to herself. She was perhaps 28 or 29. Dark hair pinned simply. A dress that was clean and well kept, but had been let out at the seams at some point and taken in again, the mark of a woman managing on reduced circumstances with considerable dignity. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and even from this distance, Oliver could see the particular roughness of them. The hands of someone who worked, the hands of someone who had been working for a very long time. She was looking directly at him, not at his hands, not at the plate, at his face. Most people in Oliver Kingsley's life did not look at his face when they were nervous. They looked at his cravat, or his collar, or some point slightly above and to the left of his actual eyes. It was a social habit he had catalogued without ever quite deciding whether it amused or exhausted him. This woman looked at him directly and without apology. Oliver stood up from his chair. The movement sent another ripple through the room, guests shifting, straightening, the social machinery recalibrating for whatever was about to happen. Mrs. Forsyth made a small sound of surprise and displeasure that Oliver neither registered nor cared about. He walked the length of the hall. He was aware of every eye in the room tracking him. He was aware of the particular quality of the silence, not comfortable silence, but the held breath kind. The kind that happened when people weren't sure yet whether what they were witnessing was something they should be seen applauding or distancing themselves from. He stopped in front of her. She didn't step back, that registered. Rebecca Caldwell. The name came from James, who had materialized silently at Oliver's left, performing his duties as required by the social situation. Widow of Thomas Caldwell, sir. The late Thomas Caldwell farmed the east parcel before his passing 2 years past. Oliver did not acknowledge James. He was looking at Rebecca Caldwell, who was looking steadily back at him. That tart, Oliver said. That was yours, it wasn't a question. She didn't make it into one either, yeah. Sir, how did you make the crust? Something shifted in her expression, the faintest flicker of surprise that he would ask that particular question of all the questions he could have asked. Then it settled. Very cold. And lard mixed in, not all butter, because butter alone makes it too brittle. You have to work it fast so it doesn't warm. And you have to stop before you think you're done. Because if you keep going until it looks smooth, you've already gone too far. Oliver was quiet for a moment. The apples. From the old tree on the eastern edge of the property. A slight pause. If you'll forgive me saying so, the ones your groundskeeper marks for cider. They're past their best for eating, but they haven't fully turned yet, so the flesh is firm, and the sweetness concentrates when it cooks. Your French chef doesn't use them, because they're not pretty. But they make a better pie than anything in the orchard proper. There was not a sound in the hall. Oliver Kingsley looked at the woman standing in the shadow of his own walls, the woman who had apparently been attending to his property with more precise attention than half his paid staff, and felt something in his chest shift into a new configuration. You know my trees, he said. I know your land, Mr. Kingsley. Her voice was quiet but absolutely level. I've been living beside it for 7 years. Oliver was aware distantly of the social disaster this conversation was constituting in real time. Adelaide Forsyth was going to describe this to 6 other women before the night was out. The story would travel the county inside a week. A man of his standing, crossing a room full of the most eligible company in 3 counties, to stand in the shadow with a farmer's widow who baked pies. He found with some surprise that he did not care even slightly. Mrs. Caldwell. He offered a slight inclination of his head, the gesture a man makes to an equal, not to a social inferior. Would you be willing to sit with me a moment and tell me about my land? Rebecca Caldwell looked at him for 3 full seconds. She was measuring him. He could see it happening, the careful, practiced assessment of a woman who had learned not to trust men of his station to mean what they said when they used that particular courteous tone. For how long? He almost smiled. As long as you'll allow. She studied him one moment more. Then she walked, not with the careful apologetic movement of someone being granted a favor, but with the simple, direct walk of a person going where they intended to go toward the smaller sitting room off the main hall, where two chairs faced the window and the noise of the gathering dropped to a murmur. Oliver followed her. Behind him he heard Mrs. Forsyth say something sharp and low to the woman beside her. He heard laughter, the mean, bright kind that is shaped like amusement, but is really shaped like warning. He heard the gathering social machinery of people deciding how to file and categorize what they had just witnessed. He sat down across from Rebecca Caldwell and he said, "Tell me what you know." She folded her hands in her lap. "Where would you like me to start?" "Wherever you think I most need to hear it." Another measuring look. Then she began. She started with the eastern parcels, the ones leased to 3 tenant families, been farming the same plots for over a decade. Oliver knew the lease agreements in general terms. He reviewed them annually with Thomas Whitaker, his land manager, and Whitaker always presented tidy numbers in a tidy ledger, and Oliver had never had reason to question them. Rebecca Caldwell described a different picture. The Hartley family father, 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, 3 young children had missed their last 2 lease payments. Oliver had signed the notice of arrears himself 2 months ago. He remembered it vaguely. Whitaker had framed it as a matter of principle. They needed to enforce the terms consistently, or the whole rental structure would go soft. "Mr. Hartley paid," Rebecca said. "Both times I was there when he paid. I helped him count the coin out because his eyesight is failing and he was afraid of making a mistake." The money went to Thomas Whitaker's hand. Oliver went very still. "Are you saying the payments weren't recorded?" "I'm saying what I know. What happened to the record after the payment was made, I wasn't present for that." There was a particular quality to the way she said it. Not accusatory, not dramatic. The same way a person states a fact that is a fact regardless of how uncomfortable it is. Rain falls down. The harvest comes in autumn. The money was paid, and Thomas Whitaker received it. "My husband tried to tell you," she said then, "before he died." Oliver looked at her sharply. "Thomas Caldwell." Her voice didn't change, but her hands pressed together slightly harder in her lap. "He was not simply a tenant farmer, Mr. Kingsley," he could read and figure. "Before we came to this county, he had worked as a clerk in Fredericksburg for 3 years. He knew how ledgers should look, and he knew when numbers didn't add up. He tried. Twice. He went to Hartwell Hall and was turned away both times by your secretary, who told him you were occupying a county business and that if he had a concern about his tenancy, he should direct it to the land manager." A pause. "To Thomas Whitaker," the ironied with quiet, brutal precision. Oliver stood up from his chair and walked to the window. The gathering beyond the sitting room had resumed its noise. He could hear laughter, the clink of glassware, Adelaide Forsyth's distinctive carrying voice. "What happened to your husband?" The silence before she answered lasted exactly long enough to tell him that the question cost her something. "He fell from the hayloft in November," she said. 3 days after, he told me he had found something in the survey records from the western boundary that didn't match what Whitaker had filed with the county clerk. He couldn't explain it to me fully. The surveying language was beyond me. He said he needed to copy the documents and get them to someone with the authority to act on them. He fell. He had worked in that barn for 4 years. He knew every rafter. He had gone up to that loft 100 times, including in the dark, because the animals needed tending regardless of daylight. Her voice was steady. "But he fell." Oliver turned from the window. She was looking at him with the same direct, assessing gaze she'd had since he first walked across the room. No tears, not because she didn't feel it. He could see that she felt it with an intensity that had nothing to do with performance. But she had apparently made a decision at some point in the last 2 years about where her grief would and would not be visible. "You've been carrying this for 2 years," he said. "I've been waiting," she said, "for someone with the authority to do something about it to come close enough to listen." And the apple tart. The barest trace of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but something like the memory of one. "I bake for the Hartley family every month," she said. "And for the Moores on the north parcel, and for old Mrs. Saunders, who lost her husband last spring and can't manage the kitchen alone anymore. When James Whitmore came around last week asking for contributions for the harvest gathering, I submitted the tart because I knew it would be served here. And I needed to be here. And I needed a reason that would hold." Oliver stared at her. You planned this. I needed you to see me, she said simply. Powerful men don't see women like me unless we give them a reason to look. The sitting room was quiet. From the hall, music started up. Someone had brought in a fiddle player, and the bright scrape of it pressed against the walls. Oliver Kingsley, who had spent the last hour being the most important man in a room full of people competing for his attention, sat back down across from a widow in a let-out dress and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he had never in his life been in the company of anyone half as formidable. Miss Caldwell, he said slowly, what exactly do you need me to do? She unclasped her hands, reached into the small bag she carried, produced a folded piece of paper, which she placed on the table between them. Start there, she said. He picked it up, unfolded it. It was a list written in a careful, precise hand of 7 names, 7 dates, 7 amounts. Beside note in smaller writing, paid in hand to T. Whitaker. Not recorded in county ledger. Source direct witness or primary document. 7 families. Oliver looked up paper. Rebecca Caldwell met his eye. My husband found the beginning of it, she said. I've spent 2 years finding the rest. I couldn't do anything with it. I didn't have the standing. I don't own land. I have no seat at any county table and no man who will speak on my behalf. What I have is the truth, completely documented, and nowhere to take it. Oliver folded the paper carefully. You have it somewhere to take it now, he said. Something changed in her face, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than that, the expression of a person who has been holding weight for so long that the offer of help is almost more difficult to receive than the weight itself. Mr. Kingsley. Her voice was careful. I need you to understand something before we go further. I am not asking for your charity. I am not asking for your pity. What my husband found and what I confirmed, it isn't just about money. Thomas Whitaker has been stealing from families who cannot afford to lose what he takes. The Hartleys nearly lost their children to hunger last January. The Moore boy, 17 years old, worked himself sick trying to make up a payment his father had already made because no one would believe them when they said it. I believe you, Oliver said. She stopped, looked at him. Just like that? I know what an honest ledger looks like, Mrs. Caldwell, and I know what a woman looks like who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by telling the truth. He put the paper in his breast pocket. You're not performing outrage, you're reporting fact. I've sat across negotiating tables from men who could not manage what you've done in this conversation tonight. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fiddle played on. Someone laughed loudly near the fireplace. People in this county see me as a useful inconvenience, Rebecca said at last. I bake their bread and mend their clothes and sit with their sick, and they are grateful in the way people are grateful for reliable weather. They do not see me, Oliver said. It was a simple sentence, without decoration. The kind of thing a person says when they mean it precisely and have decided that imprecision would be an insult. Rebecca Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, then let's get to work. She reached back into her bag and produced a second sheet of paper, and then a third. Survey notations, copied her precise hand from documents that no longer existed in the county clerk's filing cabinet because, she explained without particular emotion, they had been removed between the Tuesday Thomas Caldwell had seen them and the Thursday she had gone to look for them herself. But she had already copied them, because she had known. Oliver spread the papers on the table between them. The fiddle played, the candles burned. The most important harvest gathering Kingsley Plantation had seen in a decade continued on the other side of the wall, full of people who mattered and conversations that counted, and the ordinary machinery of wealth and power grinding its slow, certain turns. And in a small sitting room off the main hall, the richest landowner in the county and the widow, nobody had thought to thank, sat bent over a table covered in handwritten evidence, and began, together, to build the case that would change everything. What neither of them said aloud, what both of them understood, in the way that two people understand a thing when they are both thinking it at the same moment, was that Thomas Whitaker was not going to see this coming. Not from them, not from this direction. He had spent 2 years dismissing a woman who baked pies. He had spent 2 years turning away tenant farmers who didn't know the right doors to knock on. He had been very, very careful to ensure that none of the individual pieces of what he had built would ever find their way into the same room. He had not, Oliver thought, factoring in the extraordinary possibility of an apple tart. Or the woman who baked it. Rebecca was pointing to a notation in the margin of the third document, a survey mark that didn't correspond to any boundary post she had been able to locate in the field, which meant either the post didn't exist, or the map was lying and Oliver was leaning forward to look. Close enough now that he could see the careful tension in her jaw and the ink stain on her right index finger that she hadn't quite managed to scrub out, and he was thinking about two things simultaneously. The first was that Thomas Whitaker was going to have considerably fewer comfortable tomorrows than he currently anticipated. The second was something he did not yet have a name for. Something that had walked into a room between them without announcing itself. Something that had to do with the way she spoke without apology, without performance, without the constant anxious monitoring of his reactions that he had come to associate with every conversation he had. Something that had to do with the way she had said, "You have it somewhere to take it now," and then waited, still and watchful, for him to prove it. He would think about the second thing later. "Here," she said. She tapped the margin notation with one roughened finger. "This is where it starts. This is what Thomas found." Oliver looked at the mark, then he looked up at her. "Walk me through it," he said. And she did. The papers were still spread between them when James Whitmore appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, his expression carrying the particular careful neutrality of a man who had served long enough to know when his employer was doing something the rest of the household would talk about for weeks. "Sir." James addressed the space slightly above Oliver's left shoulder. "Several of the guests have inquired. Mr. Forsyth in particular has mentioned that he had hoped to discuss the mill lease before the evening concluded." Oliver did not look up from the survey notation Rebecca had been explaining. "Tell Forsyth I'll write to him next week." A pause that lasted approximately 1 second longer than it should have. "Of course, sir." James withdrew. Oliver heard him go, heard the careful closing of the door, heard the precise quality of a silence that meant a man was composing his professional face before returning to a room full of curious eyes. Rebecca had watched the exchange without comment. Now she looked back at the paper. "You'll lose business over this evening," she said. Not a question, not an apology. A statement of fact delivered with the same level tone she used for everything. "Forsyth's mill lease isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and he knows it." Oliver picked up the third document, the one with the surveyor's mark in the margin. "The boundary line he's disputing has been settled twice in county court. He comes back every 2 years hoping I've forgotten." "Have you?" "I have an excellent memory, Mrs. Caldwell." She almost smiled. He was beginning to learn the particular geography of that, almost the slight shift at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes changed fraction before the rest of her face committed to anything. It was the expression of a woman who had learned to hold everything back and had not yet decided whether this particular situation warranted letting any of it forward. He turned his attention back to the mark on the survey. What she had laid out for him over the last 40 minutes was methodical, careful, and devastating. Not because any single piece of it was conclusive on its own, she understood that, had been careful to say so, had distinguished clearly between what she had witnessed directly, what she could corroborate through documents, and what she believed but could not yet prove. That distinction told him more about her than anything else she had done tonight. Most people, when they brought accusations, brought them the way they brought everything, exaggerated by fear or anger or the pressure of their own righteousness, until the edges blurred. Thomas Caldwell's widow brought hers the way a surveyor brings a measurement, precisely, with full notation of the margin of error. The surveyor's mark was the piece that bothered him most. It was a notation indicating a boundary post at a location she had measured it herself, pacing the distance from the creek, crossing 3 times, that placed approximately 40 acres of productive farmland on the Hartwell side of the line, rather than the county common grazing land, where had been recorded in the public ledger for a decade. 40 acres didn't sound like much until you considered that those 40 acres were currently occupied by tenant farmers paying lease to Oliver Kingsley through Thomas Whitaker. 40 acres of lease payments, 7 years running, going to a land manager who had quietly redrawn a line in a private survey copy and pocketed the differential between what he told the tenants and what he recorded in the county books. "How long have you known about the boundary?" Oliver asked. Thomas found the original survey notation 8 weeks before he died. Rebecca's voice stayed level. He thought at first it was simply a filing error, something mismapped in the county records office that nobody had caught. He went to the office to compare the documents. She paused. The original field survey from 1804 was missing from the filing cabinet. The copy that replaced it had different measurements. Someone replaced the county record. Someone had access to the county record. Thomas Whitaker has served on the county surveying committee for 6 years. She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. He doesn't survey himself, but he reviews and certifies filing. He signs off on which documents are official. Oliver set the paper down very carefully. In 15 years of managing the largest landholding in 3 counties, he had encountered dishonesty the way any man of property encountered it occasionally, predictably, in the petty and opportunistic forms that human nature reliably produced. A groundskeeper who helped himself to surplus timber. A tenant who underreported his harvest yield to reduce his tithe. These were annoyances. They were the ordinary friction of enterprise. What Rebecca Caldwell had just described was not petty dishonesty. It was architecture. Someone had built a system, piece by piece, over years, using access and authority and the comfortable assumption that powerful men did not pay close attention to paperwork they trusted subordinates to manage. And Thomas Caldwell had seen it, and Thomas Caldwell had fallen from a hayloft he had climbed 100 times without incident. Oliver stood, walked to the window. The gathering beyond was thinning. Now he could hear the particular sound of departures beginning, carriages being called, the social machinery winding down for the evening. "I need to ask you something directly," he says without turning around. "And I need you to answer me the same way. I've been answering you directly since you sat down." He turned. She was watching him with that steady measuring gaze. Hands in her lap, spine straight. The gaze of a woman who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment and was not going to squander it by flinching. "Do you believe Thomas Whitaker killed your husband?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them. "I believe," she said carefully, "that my husband found something that was worth a great deal of money to someone who had spent years building something worth protecting. I believe he died 3 days after telling me he had found the most significant piece of it. I believe the timing is not a coincidence, a breath. What I cannot tell you is what happened in that barn. I wasn't there. Neither was anyone who will say what they saw. But you believe it, Mr. Kingsley." Her voice was very quiet. "I have spent 2 years living with the question. I have thought about nothing else for 2 years. And every time I follow every thread to wherever it leads me back to Thomas Whitaker, a set of numbers that don't add up, and a husband who knew what those numbers meant." She met his eyes without wavering. "Yes, I believe it." Oliver absorbed this. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" Something crossed her face, not quite contempt, but close enough to its cousin that he felt it. "The sheriff's brother-in-law," Rebecca said, "leases the grain storage on the South Road from your estate." Through Thomas Whitaker, she paused to let him work through the implication. "I went to him anyway, 8 months after Thomas died, when I had gathered enough to feel certain I wasn't simply a grieving woman imagining patterns in shadows. He listened to me for 12 minutes. Then he told me that without a witness to the accident, there was nothing to investigate, and that perhaps I should speak to my minister about finding peace." The contempt in her voice when she said the last 3 words was so precisely controlled that it was almost more devastating than if she had let it go entirely. Oliver thought about 12 minutes. He thought about a woman who had spent months carefully assembling evidence, sorting through her husband's notes by lamplight after the day's work was done, pacing off distances in empty fields to verify survey measurements, sitting across from families who were afraid to give their names in writing and had been given 12 minutes and a suggestion to pray about it. Magistrate Ellery, before he retired last spring. He was sympathetic and told me privately he believed me and was sorry he could not act without documentation from within the county records office. The new magistrate arrived 6 weeks ago from Richmond. I have written to him twice. He has not responded. She paused. I have also told 3 women in this county who know everything and can do nothing because they have no standing to act on it either. Oliver turned this over. "How much money are we talking about?" he asked. In total, Rebecca reached into her bag one more time, produced a final sheet, a column of figures, totaled at the bottom in that careful, precise hand. He looked at the total, looked at it for a long moment. "Over 7 years," she said. "Lease payments redirected. Boundary rents collected on land not properly recorded. Surplus grain sales from the western parcels that went into a private account rather than the estate ledger. I have documentation for about 2/3 of it. The rest I've estimated conservatively. The number was significant enough that Oliver felt something shift in his assessment of Thomas Whitaker, not as a man who had given in to temptation once or twice, but as a man who had looked at a position of trust and made a deliberate calculation about how much he could take before anyone with the power to stop him looked closely enough to notice. He had calculated correctly. For 7 years he had been right. Oliver folded the papers, placed them inside his coat beside the first list she had given him. Mrs. Caldwell. He came back to the table and stood across from her, not sitting this time. I am going to need you to do something that may be difficult. Most necessary things are. I need you to tell no one that we have spoken tonight. I need Whitaker to have no reason to think anything has changed between last week and next month. If he believes his position is at risk, he will move to protect it in ways that will make the documentary record harder to access. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in the particular focused attention of someone processing rapidly. You want him comfortable. I want him exactly where he is. Comfortable, confident, and still leaving a trail. Oliver paused. Can you do that? Go on as you have been for another few weeks, baking bread for the Hartleys, and mending the Moores' fence posts, and attending to the 50 things I now understand you've been attending to without giving anything away. She looked at him for a long moment. I've been doing it for 2 years, she said. A few more weeks is not a hardship. There's one more thing. She waited. I want to understand the land the way you understand it. He said it without any particular build-up, the way he stated things he had already decided. Not through ledgers, not through Whitaker's report. I want to ride the parcels and speak to the families myself. I want to understand what I own and what I've failed to pay attention to. Rebecca was quiet. That is not a small thing, she said at last. Those families have been failed by this estate's management for 7 years. If you ride out there and raise their hopes and nothing comes of it, nothing will come of nothing. His voice was flat and certain. Something will come of this, I can promise you that. You can promise that you'll try. I don't make promises I'm not certain of. I am telling you that Thomas Whitaker will answer for what he has built. I am telling you that the families on those parcels will have what they're owed. If you don't believe I mean that, tell me now and I'll find another way forward. But I'd rather have you in it. The silence stretched. Outside, a carriage pulled away on the gravel drive. Then another. The harvest gathering was emptying out. Why? Rebecca asked. The word came out quieter than she intended he could tell, from the slight tightening at the corners of her eyes, that she hadn't meant to ask it quite that plainly. Why would you want a farmer's widow in it? You have lawyers. You have county connections. You have the weight of the Kingsley name. Oliver was quiet for a moment, working out how to say what was true without saying it in a way that would put her on her guard. Because the lawyers don't know which families are afraid and which ones will speak, he said at last. Because my county connections include men who have been very comfortable with the current arrangement. And because the Kingsley name, it turns out, has been used as a shield by a man who has been stealing from the people who were supposed to benefit from its protection. He met her eyes. I need someone on those parcels who those families actually trust. You've been there every week for 2 years. That is not something I can manufacture with lawyers. Rebecca looked at her hands. He watched her work through it, saw the careful internal weighing happening, the assessment of risk against necessity, the particular calculation of a woman who had been let down by enough people in authority that hope itself had become a thing to be budgeted carefully. All right, she said finally. There are conditions. He almost smiled. I expected there would be. I attend the conversations with the tenant families. Not as a witness waiting outside. In the room. They deserve to know why this is happening and who has been carrying it, and some of them are frightened enough that a familiar face will matter more than any assurance from the estate. Agreed. And when this is resolved, however, it resolves the Hartley family's 2 missing payments are formally struck from the record. Not forgiven as charity. Stricken with documentation showing the payments were made and were stolen. Their record should show they have never been in arrears. And also agreed. She studied him. You agreed to that very quickly. It's the right thing. It doesn't require debate. Something shifted in her face again, that almost expression that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite anything he had a name for yet. I have one more condition. Name it. When you ride the eastern parcels, when you go to those families, you go without Whitaker. You tell him you want to take the air. You tell him anything. But he does not come. Tomorrow morning, he said. She looked up sharply. That soon? You've been waiting 2 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I'd rather not extend that particular debt any further than necessary. He paused. I'll have a horse brought to your farm at first light. Will you be ready? Rebecca looked at him with the expression of a woman recalibrating something she had thought she understood. I'll be ready, she said. She gathered the papers she had left on the table, not all of them. He noticed. She left the copies with him and took only her own originals, which told him she had made duplicates and knew precisely what she was keeping and what she was releasing into his custody. She folded them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing important documents carefully for a long time. When she stood, he stood as well. She was shorter than she had seemed from across the hall, or perhaps it was simply that the room was smaller than the hall. The distance collapsed. She looked up at him with that direct, unwavering gaze. Mr. Kingsley. Her voice was careful. What you said earlier. About seeing me. People say things in a moment. When the moment is gone, they often say different things. I am aware of the tendency. I need to know whether you understand what I'm risking by trusting you. He met her eyes. Your husband trusted the right person badly, he said quietly. I understand that. I understand that. You've built something careful and painstaking on your own, because there was no one you could trust with the weight of it. And that handing any piece of it to me is not a small thing, regardless of anything I've said tonight. He paused. I cannot give you a guarantee that is worth more than this one. I have looked at those papers and I know what they mean, and I am not the kind of man who can look at what I've seen tonight and then go back to Whitaker's comfortable ledgers. That is not something I can unknow. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The nod of a woman who has made a decision she intends to keep. First light, she said. She walked out of the sitting room without looking back. He heard her cross the main hall, heard the slight shift in the conversations nearest the door, the momentary attention that tracked her passage, and then heard nothing, which meant she had moved through the hall and out without engaging anyone. Oliver stood at the table with 4 sheets of evidence in his breast pocket and the sound of a departing gathering thinning the house around him. He thought about Thomas Caldwell, a man who could read and figure and who had spotted something in a ledger that he was not supposed to see and who had gone to the right door twice and been turned away both times, and who had then fallen from a hayloft he had climbed without incident for 4 years. He thought about the barn, about November, about whether a man who spent his mornings going over survey documents and his evenings going over his notes and his nights lying awake with the weight of what he'd found would be the same careful man he'd been a year before. Whether grief and fear and the grinding pressure of carrying something too heavy wore down precisely the kind of caution that kept a man from slipping on a rafter he'd crossed 100 times. Whether, in other words, a man could be maneuvered into an accident without anyone needing to do more than ensure he was tired enough and distracted enough and scared enough that his own body failed him at the wrong moment. James appeared in the doorway again. The last of the guests are departing, sir. Shall I have the kitchen send supper? Oliver looked at his house steward, a man who had served him loyally for 15 years, who knew every room of this estate and every name that passed through it. James, he kept his voice even. Thomas Whitaker. When did he begin working for me? James blinked. Sir? When did Whitaker come to us? What year? 1809, sir. Perhaps 1810. He came with strong references from the Alderton estate in Culpeper County. I want his references. The originals, whatever we have on file. Tomorrow morning, before you do anything else. James looked at him with the careful, trained expression of a man who had learned that questions were less useful than precision. Yes, sir. And James. Oliver picked up his coat from the chair where he'd left it. Nobody on this estate needs to know that Mrs. Caldwell and I spoke privately tonight. If anyone asks, and I suspect several people will, she submitted a tart for the charitable contribution, and I thanked her. That is the full account of the evening. James's expression did not change by a single degree. Of course, sir. Oliver walked out of the sitting room, through the thinning hall where the candles were guttering and the servants were beginning the clearing, and up the stairs to his study, where he locked the door and spread Rebecca Caldwell's papers across his desk and read them again from the beginning, this time slowly. This time with the intention of understanding not just what was there, but what had been carefully left off, what the edges of the record implied, what a man with the right expertise would see if he looked where the documents didn't point. He read them 3 times. By the time the house settled into silence around him, he had understood something that had not been apparent from a single reading. The scheme Thomas Whitaker had built was not the work of a man improvising opportunistically. The structure of it, the way the boundary discrepancy fed into the redirected payments, which fed into the surplus grain accounts, all of it threaded through the county surveying committee's filing procedures, so that each piece had a legitimate surface explanation, was too precise to have developed accidentally. Whitaker had arrived at Hartwell with a plan. He had surveyed the position and built his extraction system from the first year, which meant the references from Culpeper County needed to be checked not merely for their authenticity, but for what they would reveal about where Thomas Whitaker had done this before. Oliver set down the papers, pinched the bridge of his nose. Outside his window, the property was dark and quiet. Somewhere on the eastern parcel, the Hartley family was asleep in a farmhouse where the cold pressed through the walls and the father's failing eyes made the daily work harder every season. And they were asleep, not knowing that tonight, in a small sitting room off the main hall of the estate that had been taken from them for 7 years, 2 people had sat across a table and begun, together, to build something that would end it. A widow who baked tarts and a landowner who had finally belatedly looked up from his ledgers and seen what was right in front of him. He thought about what she'd said. Powerful men don't see women like me unless we give them a reason to look. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper and he began to write. The horse Oliver sent arrived at Rebecca's farm at 20 minutes before first light. She was already standing at the gate. She had not slept. He could see it in her face when he rode up behind the stable hand, not the blurred, soft look of exhaustion, but the sharp, stripped-down alertness of someone who had spent the night thinking too hard and too fast to allow for anything as restful as sleep. She was wearing her working clothes, a dark wool coat that had been her husband's by the cut of it, and she was carrying a leather satchel that he suspected contained copies of everything she had shown him the night before. She looked at him, then at the horse, then back at him. You came yourself. Did you think I'd send someone? She didn't answer that directly. She took the reins from the stable hand with practiced ease, checked the girth with the automatic competence of a woman who had spent years managing animals without help, and mounted without waiting for assistance. They rode east in silence for the first several minutes. The property unfolded around them in the gray pre-dawn light field after field that Oliver had last truly inspected 3 years ago, when the boundary dispute with the neighboring Alderton parcel had required him to physically walk the land. Before that, he had relied almost entirely on Whitaker's quarterly reports and the tidy numbers in the tidy ledger. Rebecca rode ahead by half a length, which meant he was following her. He suspected she had done that deliberately. The Hartley farm first, she said over her shoulder. Before Whitaker arrives at the estate office, he rides in from town around 8, and if he sees horses on the eastern road, he'll make a point of knowing why. You know his schedule. I know everyone's schedule. She didn't say it with pride. She said it the way a soldier states a tactical reality. When you don't have power, information is the only currency that keeps you safe. They reached the Hartley farm as the sky shifted from gray to the thin pale color that preceded actual daylight. The farmhouse was already lit, the particular kind of early morning light, through a window that meant people were up and working, not waiting for a visitor. Oliver dismounted. Rebecca was already at the door. The man who opened it was perhaps 60, with the careful, guarded face of someone who had learned to be afraid of unexpected callers from the estate. He looked at Rebecca, first visibly relaxed a fraction, and then his eyes moved to Oliver, and every muscle in his face went careful again. Mr. Hartley. Rebecca's voice was warm and level. I'm sorry for the hour. This is Oliver Kingsley. He's asked to speak with you about the lease payments from last season. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Oliver had stood in enough negotiations to read silence the way other men read text, and what he read in Samuel Hartley's silence was not the blankness of a man with nothing to say but the compressed, held-tight silence of a man who had something to say and had been told by experience that saying it did not help. Mr. Hartley. Oliver kept his voice quiet and direct. I am not here to collect anything or to discuss arrears. I am here because I have reason to believe that payments your family made were not properly recorded. I want to understand what happened. Another silence. Then Hartley stepped back from the door. They sat in the kitchen. Hartley's eldest son Daniel was there, 30 years old, with hands that looked like his father's hands would have looked 20 years ago, built from the same material, shaped by the same work. His wife sat at the far end of the table, with two children pressed against her sides, watching Oliver with the wide, wary eyes of people who had learned that men from the estate brought paperwork, and the paperwork always meant something was being taken. Hartley told it plainly. He was clearly a man who had stopped hoping that plain telling would matter, which made the plainness of it somehow worse. The payments, both of them, the October installment and the December installment, had been brought to Thomas Whitaker's office in town. He had counted the coin himself, twice in front of Whitaker. Whitaker had given him a receipt each time. "Do you still have the receipts?" Oliver asked. Hartley looked at his son. His son looked at the floor. "We had them," Daniel said. "Kept them in the strong box under the bed. 3 months after the second payment, when the arrears notice came from the estate, we went to get them." He stopped. "They were gone," Oliver finished. Daniel looked up. "How did you know?" Oliver did not answer immediately. He was thinking about a man who issued receipts, knowing he would retrieve them later, who had calculated exactly how long to wait before the heirs' notice arrived, who had understood that a free without their receipts would have nothing but their word against a land manager with clean books. "Because the same thing happened to other families," Rebecca said quietly from beside Oliver. She looked at the son when she said it. Daniel Hartley stared at her. "The Moores," Rebecca continued. "The Pickett family on the north fence line. Old Calvin Saunders before he passed." Her voice was steady and even, and carried the weight of someone who had been holding each of these names carefully for a very long time. "You are not the only ones. You were never the only one." The kitchen went very still. Hartley's daughter-in-law, who had not said a word since they arrived, pressed her hand flat on the table. It was a small gesture, but it had the quality of a woman setting down something she had been carrying for a long time. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Her voice was directed at Oliver. Directly, without the careful deferential edge that the men at the table had been using. The voice of someone who had nothing left to lose by being plain. "Your testimony," he said. "Written, signed, witnessed. The dates. The amounts. The location of the payments. And the names of anyone else present when the payments were made." "We told the sheriff. I know what the sheriff did with what you told him." Oliver's voice didn't shift into anger. It stayed flat and certain, which was more effective. "I am not the sheriff. I am the man whose name is on those leases, and I am telling you that what was done to your family was done in my name and with my estate's resources, and I intend to correct that." He paused. "This will require you to trust me. I understand that is not a small thing given what this estate has done. All I can offer you is that Mrs. Caldwell has trusted me with information that she has been safeguarding for 2 years, and I have not yet given her reason to regret it." Hartley looked at Rebecca. Rebecca gave him a single steady nod. Something broke open in the old man's face. Not dramatically, there was no collapse into tears, no sudden relief. It was quieter than that and harder. The look of a person who has maintained a certain posture against a great weight for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to put the weight down. And now the weight was shifting, and they were not yet certain what they would find underneath it. "Tell us what to write," Hartley said. They spent 90 minutes at the Hartley farm. They left with 2 signed statements, Hartley's and his son's, and the name of a witness neither of them had mentioned before, a farmhand named Eli Cooper, who had been present for both payments and had left the county 6 months later, for reasons that had seemed unremarkable at the time. Rebecca noted the name without expression. Oliver noticed her noting it. They rode to the Moore farm next, and then to the widow Saunders, who was 81 years old, and had a memory like a county ledger, and a distrust of estate men that 3 generations of experience had made completely reasonable. She softened eventually, when Rebecca sat beside her and held her hand. She gave them a statement that was, Oliver thought, the single most precisely detailed account he had heard from any witness in his professional life. "My first husband was a barrister," the old woman said without any preamble. "I know what testimony looks like, young man. I've been waiting for someone to ask me for it properly for going on 18 months. By the time they rode back toward the main road, the sun was well up, and Oliver's breast pocket contained 6 signed statements from 4 families and 2 independent witnesses. He was also carrying something else. Something that had been accumulating over the course of the morning in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had watched Rebecca with those families. He had watched her with Hartley's daughter-in-law, kneeling to speak to the youngest child, who had pressed himself against the wall and refused to come out, coaxing the boy forward with the easy, practiced patience of someone who had done this 100 times. He had watched her with the old widow Saunders, holding her hand and listening with genuine attention to a story that she had clearly heard before, because the details Saunders mentioned dovetailed precisely with entries in Rebecca's own documents. She had been holding this community together with her own 2 hands for 2 years. She had been baking bread for families who couldn't afford their own flour, and mending fences for men too old to manage the work, and sitting with the grieving, and the frightened, and the exhausted, not as charity but as the ordinary business of being the person who showed up when no one else did. And she had been doing it while simultaneously building, piece by patient piece, a legal case that would have taken a trained clerk years to assemble. Oliver reined in his horse on the main road. Rebecca pulled up beside him. "You knew Eli Cooper would be significant," he said. She looked straight ahead. "Eli saw both payments made. He told me so himself a year ago when I asked him." She paused. "He left the county 3 weeks after I spoke to him. I've been trying to find out where he went." "Why didn't you mention him last night?" "Because I didn't know if he would confirm what he'd told me in writing. A man who leaves his position and his county without explanation is a man who is afraid of something." Her jaw was tight. "I needed to know if the Hartleys could confirm he was present before I told you he existed. If they couldn't, his account would stand alone, and a frightened man's account standing alone is easier to dismantle." Oliver studied her profile. "You think Whitaker scared him off?" "I think Eli Cooper was the only paid witness to both transactions who was not a member of the Hartley family. I think Thomas Whitaker is a careful man. I think careful men remove things that create risk." She turned to look at him then, directly, with the expression she wore when she was saying something she had decided needed to be said without softening. "We need to find Eli Cooper before Whitaker knows we're looking." The weight of that hung between them. Oliver had been building toward this understanding across the entire morning, through every signed statement, through every face that had shifted from wariness to something cautious and fragile and tentative when Rebecca sat down beside them. But hearing it, said plainly, brought the shape of what they were dealing with into full relief. Thomas Whitaker was not simply a thief. Thomas Whitaker was a man who had already, in all probability, ensured that one person who knew too much was no longer a problem. A man who had the social position, the county connections, and the 2-year head start to make himself very difficult to touch. They needed Eli Cooper, and they needed him before Whitaker understood why. "I know someone in Richmond who tracks people," Oliver said. "A former army man. He finds soldiers who've gone missing or absconded with regimental funds. He's been doing it for 15 years, and he's never failed to locate a man he was properly commissioned to find." Rebecca turned this over. "How long?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3. "Whitaker won't wait 3 weeks if he knows something is happening. Then nothing will appear to be happening." Oliver met her eyes. "Can you continue as before?" "I told you last night I could." "I know what you told me last night. I'm asking again, because this morning is different from last night." He held her gaze. "Last night you knew what we were dealing with in general terms. This morning you know we're looking for a man Whitaker may have deliberately removed from the picture. That changes the weight of it." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. "Oliver." It was the first time she had used his given name. She seemed to realize it a half-second after she said it, and something moved briefly across her face, but she didn't correct it. "I have been living with the weight of this since November of 1814. It has not gotten heavier this morning. It has gotten lighter, because for the first time since my husband died, I am not carrying it alone." He had no ready response to that. He was not a man who was often without a response, and the absence of one registered somewhere specific in his chest. They rode back toward the estate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the one they had ridden out in. The earlier silence had been the careful, tentative quiet of 2 people who did not yet know what they were to each other. This one was something else, something that had less space in it, something that fit together more easily at the edges. They were coming around the curve in the road that ran behind the apple orchard when Rebecca suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. Oliver pulled up immediately. She was looking at the tree line to the left of the road, not with the idle gaze of someone noticing scenery, but with the sharp, focused attention of someone who had seen something specific. What is it? Someone's been at the boundary markers. Her voice was very quiet. Third post from the orchard fence. Look at the ground around it. Oliver looked. He couldn't see what she was seeing. But he had learned in the last 12 hours not to question her observations. When were you last on this road? 4 days ago. She hadn't taken her eyes off the marker. The earth around that post was undisturbed. You can tell when ground has been broken recently, it sits differently. She paused. Someone dug around that post within the last 4 days. Whitaker. Or someone Whitaker sent. She finally turned to look at him. He's adjusting the markers. He knows the boundary survey is going to be scrutinized at some point, maybe not ours specifically, maybe just generally, because of the new magistrate. He's moving the physical markers to match his falsified documents. The implications of that landed one at a time. Oliver worked through them quickly. If Whitaker adjusted the physical markers before any official survey was ordered, then any new survey conducted after the adjustment would appear to confirm his falsified records rather than contradict them. The paper documents and the physical ground would tell the same story. The original survey, the one Thomas Caldwell had seen, would be unverifiable. We need a surveyor, Oliver said before he finishes. We need a surveyor today. Rebecca's voice had the clipped precision of someone who had already moved past the alarm and into the response. Not next week, not when you've arranged someone from Richmond. Today, before he sends someone back to finish the work. Oliver turned his horse. Come with me. She followed without asking where they were going. He pushed the horse to a canter, and she matched. Without difficulty, she rode the way she did everything. Without hesitation. Without waste of motion. With the settled competence of someone who had been doing necessary things for a long time. They reached the estate office in 20 minutes. Oliver went directly to his desk and pulled out the county survey register, the public one, not Whitaker's private copy. He ran his finger down the list of licensed surveyors operating in the county. Only 2 names were not on the county committee. Only 2 names, therefore, had no connection to Whitaker's certification authority. One was 67 years old and had retired to his daughter's farm in Albemarle County. The other was a man named Paul Garrett, who ran a small practice out of the town of Millhaven, 12 miles east. Oliver had used him once, 6 years ago, for a boundary question on the western parcel. He had been thorough, methodical, and more importantly, entirely indifferent to the social architecture of county politics. Oliver wrote the letter standing at the desk without sitting down. Rebecca stood beside him and read it as he wrote. Say explicitly that we need the original corner posts marked, she said when he paused, and that any posts showing signs of recent disturbance should be noted in the record. He added the language, sealed the letter, called for a writer. When the writer had gone, Oliver turned from the desk to find Rebecca standing at the office window, looking out at the orchard road with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the level, steady calm she maintained as a matter of habit. Something tighter, something that was sitting very close to the surface. It's moving quickly now, she said. She wasn't addressing it to him specifically. It had the quality of a thing said aloud that had been thought in silence for too long. That's because he's making a mistake, Oliver said. A careful man who has been careful for 7 years is starting to rush. Rushing men make errors. Rushing men also do things they wouldn't otherwise do. She turned from the window. My husband found the boundary discrepancy. 3 days later, he was dead. We have just found evidence that Whitaker is actively tampering with the markers. He already knows there's a new magistrate asking questions. If he realizes that you've been on the eastern parcels this morning, he won't. Oliver's voice was certain. We were back before his office hours. No one at the estate knew where we rode. James Whitmore knew the horses went out. James has been with me for 15 years. Rebecca looked at him steadily. 7 years ago, Thomas Whitaker had excellent references from Culpeper County and your complete confidence. Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a woman who had learned to be precise about trust. I am not saying James Whitmore is dishonest. I am saying that loyalty and information are different things, and information travels through houses in ways that people don't intend. Oliver went quiet. She was right. He knew she was right. And the knowing of it was uncomfortable in the specific way that things are uncomfortable when they require you to adjust something you'd prefer not to adjust. "I'll speak to James today," he said, carefully. "Don't tell him about Cooper." "No, or about Garrett." He paused. "You've thought about this kind of thing for a long time." "I've had to," she said it without self-pity. "When you're the only person trying to protect something, think very carefully about every door and every window." There was a knock at the office door. Oliver crossed to open it. It was Daniel Hartley, which was not who he expected. The young man was breathing hard, like he'd ridden fast, and his face had the particular tight, whitened quality of someone who had come with news and was afraid of what it meant. "Mr. Kingsley." He looked past Oliver to Rebecca. "Mrs. Caldwell. I'm sorry to follow you here, I wasn't sure where else." "What happened?" Rebecca was already moving toward him. "Cooper," Daniel swallowed. "You left this morning." I remembered where he wrote to my cousin in Millhaven, about a month after he left. Asked if there was work in the area. My cousin wrote back that there might be at the Garrett surveying firm. The words settled into the room like stones dropping into water. Paul Garrett. The surveyor Oliver had written to 20 minutes ago. Who operated out of Millhaven, 12 miles east. Eli Cooper, the man who had witnessed both of the Hartley payments, who had left the county after Rebecca asked him about what he'd seen, had gone to work for the one independent surveyor in the county who had no connection to Thomas Whitaker's certification committee. Oliver looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at the letter that had just ridden east. "He's there," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He's been 12 miles away for a year. And we just sent a letter to his employer with your seal on it, which Whitaker will hear about from someone in town before the day is out." Oliver had the letter recalled within 10 minutes. He sent a second rider after the first, with instructions to stop the delivery and bring both back. Then he sat down at his desk and wrote a second letter, different in content, different in stated purpose, asking Garrett to conduct a general survey review of the Hartwell western boundary, with no mention of the eastern parcels, and no language that would indicate anything beyond a routine property check. Rebecca watched him write this one too. "You're protecting Cooper," she said. "I'm protecting the case." He blotted the letter. "If Whitaker learns we're looking at the eastern boundary, and that a key witness is 12 miles away, Cooper is in danger, and the evidence is compromised. We get Garrett out here on a different pretext. We meet Cooper through Garrett, quietly, privately, in a setting that looks like routine business." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "You're better at this than I expected," she said. "I've been running a large estate for 15 years. Most of what that involves is anticipating what will go wrong and redirecting before it does." He sealed the second letter and handed it to the waiting rider. "The difference is that until last night, I was redirecting around the wrong things." She absorbed that without comment. But something in her posture shifted, a slight easing, barely perceptible. The kind of shift that happens in a person when they have been holding themselves very carefully against the possibility of disappointment and begin, cautiously, to believe that the disappointment may not come. It was late afternoon before the first rider returned with the original letter undelivered as instructed. The second rider had already gone east with the revised version. Oliver was at his desk, reviewing the statements from the morning's farm visits, when his office door opened without a knock. Thomas Whitaker walked in. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular groomed solidity of a man who understood the importance of appearance to authority. He had worked for Oliver for 7 years, and in those 7 years Oliver had found him reliable, organized, and unobtrusive in the exact proportion that a good land manager should be. He was carrying his hat in one hand and a ledger in the other, and his expression was the pleasant, competent, slightly deferential expression he always wore when entering Oliver's office on business. His eyes moved across the room in the first second. They took in Oliver at the desk, the papers spread in front of him, and in the corner, reading from her own satchel, Rebecca Caldwell. The pleasant expression did not disappear, but something underneath it shifted. "Mr. Kingsley." He remained in the doorway. "I wasn't aware you had a visitor." "Come in, Whitaker." Oliver's voice was easy. "I've been meaning to ask you about the Eastern Parcel Boundary Survey. There's a notation in the 1804 field record that doesn't correspond to the current county filing. Probably a clerical issue at the clerk's office, but I'd like to have Garrett take a look before the next county committee review. Whitaker's eyes moved to Rebecca one more time, then back to Oliver. Of course. He set the ledger on the side table. I wasn't aware there was a discrepancy. Which notation in particular? Oliver turned the county filing copy toward him and indicated the margin. Whitaker leaned over to look. His face betrayed nothing. He was very good. 7 years of practice made a man very good. But his right hand, Oliver noticed, gripped the edge of the desk for exactly 2 seconds before releasing. I'll look into it, Whitaker said pleasantly. I'm sure it's a filing matter. The clerk's office has been disorganized since young Patterson took over from his father. I'm sure you're right. Mrs. Caldwell was just dropping off the charitable contribution records from last night's gathering. She's been kind enough to keep track of the donor tallies for us. Whitaker looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked back at him with a face as smooth and uninformative as still water. He gave her the small courteous nod that a man of his station gave a woman of her station when he had decided she was beneath his concern. The nod of a man who had already filed her as insignificant and was therefore not afraid of her. Mr. Whitaker. He picked up his hat. Made his departure with the unhurried, comfortable ease of a man who had decided nothing of importance was happening. The door closed. Rebecca did not move for 3 seconds. Then she let out a breath that was controlled and careful and very quiet. Oliver looked at her. He'll check the boundary markers tonight, she said. Now that he knows you're looking at the 1804 filing, he'll want to be certain the physical posts match his documents before Garrett arrives. I know. We need someone watching the Orchard Road after dark. I've already thought of that. Oliver stood. One of the estate hands, a man named Amos, who has been with us since before Whitaker arrived and has no reason to report to him, will be watching from the tree line tonight. He paused. I made those arrangements this morning before we went to the farms. Before you told me about the markers, Rebecca stared at him. You suspected the markers before I saw them. I suspected that a man adjusting paper records would eventually need to adjust physical ones to match. He met her eyes steadily. Your observation this morning confirmed what I'd already been considering. It matters, because it means we have a witness for exactly this action before Whitaker knows to be careful about it. The silence in the room had a different texture now. Something was happening between them that neither of them had named, and both of them were aware of the particular gravity that builds when two people have been working in close quarters toward a common purpose and have discovered, without quite intending to, that they think alike. Oliver, Rebecca said quietly. He waited. When this is over, she stopped. Tried again. When this is finished, and the families have what they're owed, and Whitaker has answered for what he's done, I need you to know that I am not interested in. She pressed her lips together briefly, choosing the words. I don't want what happened last night, with the Tart, to become a story people tell. A story about the poor widow who got lucky because the rich man noticed her. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want it to be? She met his gaze directly without flinching. I want it to be a story about two people who saw the same injustice and decided to do something about it. A pause. That's all. That, he said at last, is exactly what it is. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the eastern Orchard Road, the sun was going down over a boundary marker that a careful, frightened man would come to move under cover of darkness, never knowing that someone was already watching from the tree line. And in the land manager's office, in a drawer that had never once been locked, because why would it need to be? A ledger sat waiting that contained 7 years of careful, patient, meticulous crime, and that would, before the week was out, find its way into Oliver Kingsley's hands. Whitaker had built something he believed was untouchable. He had built it slowly, on the certainty that the people who could stop him were not paying attention, and the people who were paying attention had no power. He had not planned for the specific combination of a widow who counted coins and a landowner who finally looked up from his ledgers. He had not planned, in other words, for this. Amos returned before midnight. Oliver was still at his desk when the knock came. 3 short, deliberate raps, the signal they had agreed on. He crossed to the side door himself rather than calling anyone, and Amos came in with mud on his boots and the particular controlled expression of a man who had seen something and was working out how to report it accurately. He came, Amos said, about 2 hours after dark. Came alone on foot, carrying a post driver and a surveyor's chain. Oliver went very still. How many posts? 3, on the eastern orchard line, just where Mrs. Caldwell pointed this morning. He moved them maybe 6-8 inches each. Pack the ground back careful after. You wouldn't know they'd been touched, looking at them in daylight. Amos paused. I marked the original positions before he came. Drove small stakes into the ground 4 feet back in the tree line, lined up with where the posts stood. So there's a record of where they were. Oliver looked at him. That was not something I asked you to do. No, sir. Amos met his eyes without apology. But Mrs. Caldwell told me this morning, when you were speaking with Daniel Hartley, that the position of those posts before any tampering would matter as much as the tampering itself. She said if someone moved them, the before would be as important as the after. He paused. So I made the before. Oliver absorbed this. He thought about Rebecca standing in the Hartley kitchen while he spoke with Daniel, and he thought about her moving quietly to speak with Amos while he was occupied. And he thought about the particular quality of a mind that thought 3 steps ahead without making a performance of it. You did exactly right, he said. Don't mention this to anyone on the estate. Not James, not the kitchen staff, no one. Understood? Yes, sir. After Amos left, Oliver sat for a long time without writing, without reading, without moving. He was thinking about Thomas Whitaker in the dark alone, moving boundary posts 6 inches at a time with the methodical care of a man who had been maintaining his own safety through exactly this kind of precise, quiet work for 7 years. He was thinking about Thomas Caldwell, who had seen what was happening and had tried twice to reach the man who could stop it, and been turned away both times by ordinary, unremarkable institutional machinery. He was thinking about what it cost a person to be right about something important, when everyone with the power to act was either corrupt or indifferent, or simply too comfortable to look. He picked up his pen and wrote a letter to Paul Garrett. Not the revised version asking for a routine Western boundary check. The original intent fully stated, with the precise location of the eastern posts and Amos's stake markers included. He sealed it. Then he wrote a second letter shorter, without a salutation, without his own name on it, addressed to the Garrett surveying firm in Millhaven, marked for the attention of a man named Eli Cooper if such a person was employed there. The second letter said only, "You are not in danger from this direct. We need your account. Come when you can." He sent both letters before dawn by a writer he trusted, a young man named Will who had been raised on the estate, whose mother still worked the kitchen, and who had no professional relationship with Thomas Whitaker of any kind. He did not tell Rebecca he had done this. He would, he decided, but not until he knew whether Cooper would come. The storm arrived on the 3rd day. It came in from the northwest the way the worst storms always came, not with the dramatic buildup of thunder that gave you time to prepare, but fast and flat and without warning, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in an hour, and arriving with the kind of sideways driving rain that found every gap in every roof and pressed through every wall seam and turned the estate road to a channel of brown water inside of 20 minutes. Oliver was in his study when he heard the kitchen block alarm, a handbell that James had instituted years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. He reached the kitchen courtyard to find 3 of the estate staff already there, and James directing them to secure the roof sections that had been threatening to separate from their framing since the spring. He also found, arriving from the direction of the road, Rebecca Caldwell on a horse that was coated in mud to the saddle. She dismounted before the animal fully stopped, handed the reins to the nearest person, and crossed to Oliver with water running off the brim of her hat. The Hartley farm roof, she said without preamble. The main beam over the kitchen section. It's been compromised since last winter, and the weight of this rain. She stopped. Wiped rain from her face with the back of her hand. Daniel sent his youngest boy to me on foot 20 minutes ago. If that beam goes, the whole kitchen section comes down on top of whatever's stored beneath it. They have 6 months of preserved food under that floor. Oliver was already turning toward the stable. How far? 2 miles east, maybe a quarter mile more. She was already moving with him. I know where they keep their spare timber. I know the beam configuration. I've helped repair that roof twice. Oliver looked at her soaked through, entirely matter-of-fact about it, already calculating. Then let's go, he said. James appeared at his shoulder. Sir, the east road in this weather. We'll hold for a cart if we move now. Oliver took the reins of the horse. A stable hand had rushed forward. James, I need 2 men with carpentry experience. A cart with timber and iron strapping. And I need them ready in 5 minutes. James opened his mouth, closed it, gave a single nod, and turned. Rebecca was already mounted again. They made the Hartley farm in under 30 minutes, though it felt longer through rain that came sideways, and a road that wanted to pull the cartwheels sideways into the ditches. Oliver drove the cart himself. Rebecca rode ahead, and twice she held up a hand to signal him around a section of road that had turned to genuine sink. Her knowledge of every inch of this land as accurate as a surveyor's, and considerably more practically applied. The Hartley kitchen beam had not yet failed, but it was speaking the low, periodic creak of stressed timber working against its own limits. Daniel Hartley was already up in the roof framing when they arrived, braced against the worst of the weather, with a face that was somewhere between determination and terror. Oliver climbed up without taking off his coat. He had grown up on this property. He had spent his childhood in these buildings and these fields before he became the man behind the desk. He knew timber, and he knew load, and he knew the particular sound a beam made when it had given everything it was going to give, and was preparing to give way. This beam had perhaps 2 hours, maybe less if the wind shifted. We sister the beam, he said to Daniel. New timber on each side, strapping lag bolts through all 3. We don't try to replace it tonight. We support it until the weather breaks, and we can do the work properly. Daniel looked at him, the particular look of a young man, recalibrating what he had assumed about who he was dealing with, and then he nodded, and they got to work. Rebecca was below in the kitchen, which was still intact but cold and wet and frightened. She had the Hartley children organized around the hearth with blankets and the particular calm competence of someone who had talked frightened people through difficult situations enough times to know that. Calm itself was the most useful thing she could offer. She kept her voice level and her hands busy, and she told the children they were fine, that the men upstairs knew exactly what they were doing, and her certainty was so absolute and so unconditional that Oliver, working in the framing above, could hear it through the floor and felt it steady him. They worked for 3 hours. The estate carpenter Oliver had brought completed the sistering, while Oliver and Daniel held the original beam from opposite sides against the wind pressure. And there was a period of perhaps 20 minutes, during which Oliver was genuinely uncertain whether the repair was going to stay ahead of the storm or fall behind it. His hands were freezing. His coat was soaked through to the shirt beneath. His boots were waterlogged. He did not stop. He did not suggest stopping. He worked beside Daniel Hartley in the way that 2 people work when the thing they are protecting matters more than their own discomfort. And at some point in the 2nd hour, Daniel looked across the beam at him and said, My father said he never thought he'd see a Kingsley up in a roof. Said the last one who ever set foot on this farm was your grandfather, the year of the bad frost when he came out with firewood. Oliver didn't have the breath to answer properly. He gave the timber he was holding a quarter turn to align it with the sister beam. Your family has been on this land since before I was born, he said. I should have been up in this roof years ago. They got the repair done with 40 minutes to spare before the wind shifted and the full weight of the storm's 2nd phase came in from the west. When Oliver climbed down from the framing, his legs were shaking with cold and extended effort, and he was not embarrassed about it, which surprised him slightly. There had been a time when he would have managed his physical state more carefully in front of others. He could not precisely locate when that had stopped mattering. The kitchen was warm. Rebecca had somehow, during the 3 hours above, kept the hearth going, and the children settled and produced, from what materials were available, enough hot food for everyone in the building. She was at the hearth when Oliver came through the door, and she turned when she heard him, and she looked at him waterlogged, exhausted, sawdust in his hair, coat destroyed with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not the measuring look, not the level, careful assessment she used the way other people used shields. Something less defended than that. Something warmer. Before you fall down, I'm fine. You've been braced against a beam in a winter storm for 3 hours. Sit down, Oliver. He sat. She brought him something hot in a tin cup, and when he took it from her, their fingers overlapped briefly on the metal, and neither of them moved away from the contact immediately. She noticed him not moving. He noticed her noticing. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which was long enough to be something other than accidental. She stepped back, turned to check on the children. He drank what was in the cup. It was cider, heated with something spiced, and it went down like a physical argument against the cold. Old Hartley came in from somewhere, shaking water off his hat, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Oliver at the table. He looked at the repaired state of his home, evidenced by the absence of the sounds that had been coming through the ceiling for the last 3 hours. He looked at Rebecca, who was tucking a blanket around his youngest grandchild with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing this particular task for years. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Caldwell has been coming to this farm for 2 years. Every week, near enough. She brought bread when we couldn't make our own. She sat with my wife the night Eleanor passed." His voice was level, but his hands were moving, turning his hat brim around and around. "I've thanked her plenty, but I don't know as I've told her proper. So I'm telling you both now, since you're here together." He stopped turning the hat. "This family would not have made it through last winter without her. And whatever you two are building, whatever it is that brought you both out here in this storm, I hope it holds." The kitchen was quiet. Rebecca had her back to the room, adjusting the blanket, and Oliver could see from the set of her shoulders that she was working to keep her face arranged. "It'll hold," Oliver said. He said it quietly, and with the same certainty he had used with Rebecca 3 days ago, not a promise made to comfort, but a statement made because it was true and he intended it to remain so. She turned around after a moment. Her face was composed, but her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. They didn't leave the Hartley farm until well after dark, when the storm had moved east and the road was passable again, and there was nothing more to be done that couldn't wait for morning. Daniel pressed food on them for the ride back, wrapped biscuits, dried fruit, with the particular insistent generosity of people who have very little and give it anyway, which is the kind of generosity that lands differently than any other kind. They rode back to the estate road in single file, the cart wheels slower now in the residual mud, and about a mile out from Hartwell. Rebecca pulled her horse alongside the cart and rode level with Oliver. "Your hand," she said. He looked at them, on the reins. The cold had done its work. The skin over his knuckles was split in 2 places, the kind of shallow cuts that sting out of proportion to their size. "They're fine. Stop the cart." He stopped the cart. She reached into the satchel she apparently carried with her absolutely everywhere, and she produced a small tin of salve and a strip of clean linen that she must have taken from the Hartley kitchen without making a point of it. "Give me your hand." He held out his right hand. She took it without ceremony, examined the damage, and began wrapping the split skin with the competent, unhurried attention of someone who had bandaged hands like this before. Her fingers were cold but steady. Her grip was firm without being hard. He watched the top of her head bent to the work. "You spend every day of your life doing this," he said. "For other people. Somebody has to." "Who does it for you?" She didn't answer immediately. She tied off the linen with a neat and held his hand for a moment after, looking at the bandage, checking her own work. "Forgot," she said at last. Her voice was very quiet. "I forgot that someone could." Oliver looked at her. She was still looking at his hand, not at his face, and he thought she was probably aware that she'd said something that gave more away than she typically allowed herself to give away, and that she was deciding whether to recover from it or let it stand. He turned his hand over beneath hers, not dramatically. Just a slight shift of weight, a question, not a statement. The road was dark around them, and the storm had left the air sharp and clean and cold. And they were looking at each other in the particular way that 2 people look at each other when they have been through something together that neither of them had planned, and both of them are still feeling. "Rebecca," he said. Not with sharpness, not with refusal, with the careful, considered tone of a woman who was protecting something she could not afford to misjudge. "Not yet. There's still too much that isn't settled." He released her hand. She gathered her reins. They rode on. Neither of them spoke for the remainder of the ride, but the silence had changed, again had shifted into something that was less like absence and more like a thing that was being held in place until the right moment to let it go. Paul Garrett arrived 2 days after the storm, riding in from Millhaven with his instruments packed in oilskin cases and a quiet, methodical manner that Oliver recognized and respected. He was a spare, Careful man of 50 with a surveyor's habit of looking at the ground rather than at faces. And he took Oliver's briefing without reaction, asking only precise, technical questions about the notations in question and the condition of the corner posts. He went to the Eastern Line that afternoon. He came back 4 hours later and stood in Oliver's office with mud on his boots and a face that was arranged in the careful neutral expression of a man presenting findings he knew would not be welcome. The posts have been moved, Garrett said recently. Within the last week, I'd estimate, based on the soil disturbance. He set his field notes on the desk. The current positions match the figures in the county filing. The positions indicated by the stake markers your man Amos placed. He gestured at his notes. Those match the 1,804 original field survey notation that Mrs. Caldwell copied before the county record was altered. Oliver looked at the notes, looked at the numbers. 43 acres, not 40. 43 acres of productive farmland had been quietly removed from the county common record and absorbed into a private leasing arrangement, with the differential payments disappearing into Thomas Whitaker's private accounts for 7 years. Can you certify this finding officially? Oliver asked. I can certify the discrepancy between the current post positions and the original 1,804 survey coordinates. Yes? Garrett paused. I would also note, for completeness, that a member of the county surveying committee should not have the authority to unilaterally alter a filed survey record without a full committee review. Whatever process was followed to substitute the county document, it was not the correct one. It was no process at all, Oliver said. The original was removed and replaced. Garrett absorbed this without visible surprise. He had been in his profession long enough to have seen the mashitri falsification in its various forms. There is one more thing, Garrett said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a sealed letter, which he set on the desk beside his field notes. A man in my employ asked me to deliver this privately. He was quite specific that it should come to your hand directly, without going through your estate office. Oliver looked at the letter. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, careful, the hand of a man accustomed to precision. He picked it up, broke the seal. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he sat down. Eli Cooper had not simply witnessed the Hartley payments. He had, during the 6 months he worked on the eastern parcels before leaving the county, been asked by Thomas Whitaker to carry sealed correspondence twice monthly to a solicitor's firm in Richmond. He had not known what the correspondence contained. But he had, because he was a man who had grown up with a bookkeeper father and couldn't help noticing numbers, seen one letter before it was sealed, left open on Whitaker's desk while Whitaker stepped out. The letter had contained an accounting, a private accounting, separate from any Kingsley estate record, of funds held in a solicitor's account in Richmond, under a name that was not Thomas Whitaker's name. The name on the account was Edward Marsden. Oliver stared at that name for a long time. Edward Marsden was Thomas Whitaker's brother-in-law. He was also, as Oliver knew from the count records he had reviewed 3 nights ago, the former deputy county clerk who had left his position 18 months ago, around the time a new county clerk had been appointed and had begun a review of the office's filing systems. The money was not sitting in Thomas Whitaker's name. It had never been in Whitaker's name. It was in an account held by a relative with a clean record and a former position of official trust, insulated from any direct connection to the man who had generated it. Oliver had been building a case against a thief. He was looking at a case against a conspiracy. He needed a lawyer, not a county lawyer. Anyone operating in this county was too close to Whitaker's network. He needed someone from outside, someone with no existing entanglement in the social and professional architecture that Whitaker had so carefully cultivated. He thought of a name. A man he had done business with twice in Richmond. A lawyer named Harlan Cade, who practiced property and estate law and who had a reputation in the Richmond professional community for being the person you hired when the case was real, and you needed it handled without regard for social complication. Oliver wrote the letter to Cade immediately, while Garrett was still in the room, because having Garrett as a witness to the moment of commissioning was the kind of detail that mattered later. He sealed it, handed it to Garrett directly. Can I ask you to carry this to Richmond personally? Not through the regular post. I'll compensate you for the journey. Garrett looked at him steadily. The man whose name is on that account, Garrett said. Marsden. He was the deputy clerk who certified my firm's county survey filings for 3 years before he left his position. Oliver went still. He certified your filings, every one of them. Which means he had access to the original documents and the authority to substitute records without triggering a committee review. Garrett's voice remained level and precise. I mention this not because it affects my professional findings, which stand on their own merits, but because you should know the full scope of what you're looking at. The full scope was larger than Oliver had understood 3 days ago. Larger than he had understood, this morning it had begun as a land manager stealing lease payments. It had become a coordinated scheme involving a county official who was now in private acts in 7 years of diverted funds held in a shielded account, falsified county records, tampered boundary marker, and at the center of everything a farmer who had found the thread that unraveled it and who had not survived his discovery. Oliver looked at the letter in Garrett's hand. Take it to Cade today if you can write it. Garrett put the letter in his coat pocket. He picked up his field notes. He left with the same quiet, methodical efficiency with which he did everything, without drama and without delay. Oliver sat alone in his office with Eli Cooper's letter on the desk in front of him. He had not told Rebecca about Cooper's letter yet. He had not told her about the written account, nor about Marsden, nor about the full dimensions of what they were actually building a case against. He had been protecting her from the larger fear while he confirmed the details. He understood that this was a thing he had done, for reasons that were not entirely practical that some part of him had wanted. In the days since the harvest gathering, to be the person standing between her and the worst of what this was. Not because she needed protecting, but because the instinct was there, and he had not quite managed to suppress it. But she needed to know. She had built this from the beginning. She had the right to know what she had built and what it was going to require. He sent a note to her farm. She arrived at dusk, reading his face in the first 3 seconds of crossing the threshold. And before he had said a word, she sat down across the desk from him with her hands folded and her jaw set and said, "Tell me all of it." So he did. He told her about Cooper's letter, about the Richmond account, about Marsden and what Garrett had revealed about his position as the man who had certified county survey filings. He told her about the full shape of the scheme as he now understood it, not a single man's opportunism, but a constructed partnership between a land manager and a county official, built to extract money from an estate and a tenant population over years, shielded from discovery by official access and protected from consequence by the comfortable assumption that no one would ever look hard enough in the right places. He told her about Harlan Cade and the letter Garrett had taken to Richmond. When he finished, the office was quiet. Rebecca sat without moving for a long moment. Her hands were still folded on the table. Her face was composed. But there was something happening behind her eyes, something that was moving fast, and that she was managing with visible, controlled effort. My husband found this, she said finally. He found the beginning of it, and he knew what it was. He knew it was bigger than one man and one ledger. She stopped. He tried to tell me that the night before he fell. He said, "It's not just Whitaker." Those were his exact words. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he meant the survey documents. I didn't know he meant. She pressed her lips together. You didn't have the piece about Marsden, Oliver said quietly. Neither did he. He'd found the survey discrepancy. The Richmond account was a connection he might have reached eventually but hadn't documented yet. He died before he could. She was quiet. He would have been frightened, she said. Her voice was very low if he'd understood how large it was. He would have been frightened for me, and the children we'd been hoping for, and for those families, on the parcels who had no one else. He would have been frightened, and he would have kept going anyway. Because that was who he was, a breath. That is why I kept going. Because stop felt like saying it didn't matter. Like saying he didn't matter. Oliver did not trust himself to speak for a moment. It mattered, he said at last. He mattered. What he found and what it cost him, it's the foundation that everything we've built this week is sitting on. Cade will understand that. The magistrate will understand it. Rebecca looked at him, the magistrate. Something sharpened in her expression. We haven't spoken to him yet. The new one, Morrison. I wrote to him twice and received no reply. I wrote to him yesterday. Under my own name with the estate's seal. Oliver's voice was flat. He replied this morning. He can receive us the day after tomorrow at the county courthouse. The shift in her face was not dramatic, but it was real. The particular expression of a person who has been pushing against a closed door for so long that they have stopped expecting it to open, and it has just opened. 2 days. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. Oliver. Her voice carried something in it that hadn't been there before, something unguarded, something that had decided to come forward, despite her careful management of what she permitted to be visible. I don't know how to do this part. Which part? The part where I trust that it's going to work out. She met his eyes. I know how to keep going when I'm certain nothing will come of it. I know how to work in the dark. I don't know. She stopped. Try it again. I'm afraid of hoping. He held her gaze. Then don't hope yet, he said. We go to Morrison in 2 days. We take the statements. We take Garrett's survey certification. We take Cooper's letter. We take 7 years of documentation that you have spent 2 years of your life building. We let the evidence speak. A pause. And if it isn't enough, if Morrison is another dead end, then we go above Morrison. We go to Richmond. We go as far as we need to go. His voice was steady and certain and without decoration. I am not going to let this stop. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? Her voice was quieter than she intended. You could have closed this office 3 days ago. You could have dismissed Whitaker quietly and settled with the families privately and kept the Kingsley name out of any public proceeding. You have every incentive to manage this quietly and every resource to do it. My name has been used to steal from those families for 7 years, he said. Quiet management is not justice. It is convenience dressed up to look like resolution. He held her gaze. And your husband deserves better than quiet management. The last sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Rebecca Caldwell, who had not cried in front of anyone since the night Thomas was buried, pressed her hand flat on the desk between them and looked down at it, and was very still for 10 full seconds. Up. Her eyes were bright. Her jaw was set. Her spine was straight. The day after tomorrow, then, she said. The day after tomorrow, he confirmed. Outside, the last of the storm's aftermath moved through the trees in long, slow sweeps. And somewhere on the eastern orchard road, 3 boundary markers stood where Thomas Whitaker had moved them, waiting to be measured against the stakes that Amos had driven into the tree line. The patient. Precise evidence of a thing done in the dark by a man who had believed, until this week, that the dark was entirely his. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about a great many things. He was about to find out exactly how many. Magistrate James Morrison was not what Oliver had expected. He was younger than Oliver by at least 5 years, which placed him somewhere in his early 30s with the lean, precise manner of a man who had come up through the Richmond court system rather than through the comfortable social networks of rural county politics. He had a lawyer's habit of writing while you talked, and he looked up from his notes with the frequency of someone who was comparing what he heard against what he'd already recorded, checking for inconsistency in real time. He had received them in the county courthouse at the appointed hour without making them wait in the hall, which told Oliver something. Men who wanted to demonstrate authority made you wait. Morrison had opened the door himself. Rebecca had dressed carefully. Not elaborately, she didn't have elaborate, but with the precision of a woman who understood that how she presented herself in this room would affect how her words were received, and who had made her peace with that reality, without letting it diminish her. Her hair was pinned back. Her coat was the dark wool one. Her husband's cut, which Oliver had come to understand, was the coat she wore when she meant business. She carried the satchel. Oliver had Harlan Cade beside him. The Richmond lawyer had ridden in the previous evening, read everything Oliver sent him, and arrived at the courthouse with the composed, unhurried energy of a man who had seen worse and won it. He was 55 years old, gray at the temples, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had been underestimated enough times to find it useful rather than irritating. They laid it out for Morrison in the order they had rehearsed. Oliver first, establishing the estate context and his discovery of the discrepancy. Garrett's certified survey findings second, presented by Garrett himself, who had ridden back from Richmond the night before. Cade presenting the legal framework of the falsified county records, and then Rebecca. Morrison had been writing steadily. When Rebecca sat down across from him and set the satchel on the table, he looked at her directly for the first time. Mrs. Caldwell. His voice was measured and professional. I understand you have been compiling this documentation for approximately 2 years. Since 6 weeks after my husband was buried, Rebecca said. Yes, walk me through how you obtained the primary witness statements. She walked him through it. Every name, every date, every conversation. She did not hesitate, did qualify unnecessarily, did not perform either distress or detachment. She spoke the way she had spoken to Oliver in the sitting room 11 days ago, with the precise, unornamented clarity of a person who had been waiting a long time for a room that deserved the truth and had finally found one. Morrison wrote. He asked questions, sharp ones, the questions of a man looking for the weak points in an account, not to undermine it but to understand where it would face challenge and whether it would hold. It held. Every time he pressed, Rebecca had the document, the witness, the corroborating detail. Every time he asked where she had gotten something, she could tell him exactly, with the specificity of a woman who had kept records of her records. When she finished, Morrison set down his pen. He looked at the papers spread between them. He looked at Cade, he looked at Oliver. Then he looked back at Rebecca. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, I received 2 letters from you over the course of the last 6 weeks. I did not respond to them. The room went quiet. Rebecca's expression did not change, but her hands under the table pressed together. I'm aware, she said. I want to tell you why. Morrison's voice was careful and even. When I arrived in this county 6 weeks ago, I was given a thorough orientation by several senior members of the county professional community. Thomas Whitaker was among them. He described you to me during that orientation as a troubled widow who had been making unfounded accusations against estate management. Out of grief and financial desperation, he paused. He was quite convincing. Something moved through Oliver, a hot, quick surge of anger that he contained with effort. Rebecca was very still, and now she said. Morrison looked at the paper. Now I have a certified survey discrepancy. 6 signed witness statements. Documentary evidence of payments made and not recorded. A letter from an independent witness describing a private accounting ledger held under a third party's name. And 2 years of meticulous documentation compiled by a woman who, as far as I can determine, had every reason to give up and chose not to. He picked up his pen. I am sorry I did not respond to your letters, Mrs. Caldwell. That was an error of judgment on my part, and I intend to correct it. Rebecca let out a breath that was so controlled it was barely audible. Cade, beside Oliver, made a small sound that was either professional satisfaction or something close to it. What happens now? Oliver asked. I issue a summons for Thomas Whitaker today. Morrison was already writing. And a separate summons for Edward Marsden in Richmond. I'll need both men to appear before a formal county hearing within 30 days, he looked up. I'll also be requesting that the Richmond solicitor's firm holding the Marsden account freeze all transactions pending investigation. Mr. Cade, if you can prepare the application. Already drafted, Cade said. He produced a document from his own case. Morrison looked at it. Looked at Cade. How long have you had that ready? Since yesterday evening, Cade said pleasantly. I prefer to be prepared. The summons for Thomas Whitaker was served that afternoon. Oliver was not present for it. He had returned to Hartwell with Rebecca and Cade to wait. And the waiting was the hardest part of the day, harder than the hearing. Harder than the preparation. Harder than anything that had required active effort. Waiting required a different kind of discipline, the discipline of trust that the machinery you had put in motion would turn the way it was supposed to turn. Rebecca managed it by working. She sat at Oliver's desk. He had given it to her without being asked. Pulling up a chair from the side of the room for himself, and organized the copies of everything they had submitted into a clean file that could be reproduced if the originals were challenged. Her handwriting was steady, her hands did not shake. She worked with the focused efficiency of a woman converting anxiety into usefulness, which Oliver recognized as a strategy he respected because it was his own. The news came back from town at 4:30. The sheriff's deputy who served the summons had found Thomas Whitaker in his office, as expected. What had not been expected was what he found when he arrived. Whitaker was in the process of removing documents from his filing cabinet. Not in the panicked, frantic way of a man caught in the act. He had apparently been doing it methodically, unhurriedly, with the file boxes already stacked and a cart waiting outside. He had known, or he had suspected. Either the county rumor mill had reached him faster than they had anticipated, or he had been watching closely enough to see the pieces moving and had started to act. The deputy had secured the office immediately. The documents in the boxes, whatever Whitaker had already removed, were now in county custody. Oliver read the deputy's report standing in the hallway, and then he walked back into the office and handed it to Rebecca without a word. She read it. Her jaw tightened. He was going to run, she said. He was going to clean up and then run, Oliver said. He started with the files, what was in the boxes. The deputy's report doesn't specify fully. It says correspondence and accounting records. Oliver sat down. Cade will be at the county office within the hour to review what's been secured. Whatever Whitaker pulled, we have enough without it. But if what he was removing turns out to be more documentation of the Richmond account, then he just handed us the rest of the case, Rebecca finished. She set the report down on the desk. She pressed her palm flat against it, very deliberately, and stared at the paper for a moment with an expression that was too complex to name, simply relief and grief and fury and something exhausted all occupying the same face at once. Rebecca. Oliver's voice was quiet. She looked up. It's moving, he said. Exactly the way it's supposed to move. Stay with it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. One firm, decided nod. She picked up her pen and went back to the file. The county hearing was set for the 23rd of November. 31 days from the morning in Morrison's office. Those 31 days moved with the grinding administrative slowness of institutional machinery, doing its necessary and deeply unglamorous work. Cade filed motions. Morrison issued orders. The Richmond solicitors firm, presented with the application Cade had already drafted, froze the Marsden account. Within 4 days, a decision that apparently sent Edward Marsden to a Richmond lawyer of his own within 48 hours of the freeze, which Cade learned from a colleague in the Richmond professional community, and which he relayed to Oliver, quiet satisfaction of a man watching a well-laid plan follow its intended course. Whitaker retained counsel. His lawyer, a county man named Briggs, who had been practicing in this area for 20 years and whose professional survival depended on the health of the county's existing social relationships, made 3 motions in the first week, all of which Morrison denied with a precision and speed that suggested he had anticipated them. Eli Cooper came in from Millhaven on the 2nd week. He arrived at Hartwell in the early morning, riding a borrowed horse, and Oliver brought him into the study where Rebecca was already waiting. Cooper was perhaps 35, a lean, careful man with the look of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had made a tentative decision to stop. He sat down across from Rebecca and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I'm sorry I left," he said. The apology was directed at her, not at Oliver. "When you asked me what I'd seen, I knew what it meant. I knew what happened to Mr. Caldwell. I had a family of my own to think about, and I stopped." "It doesn't excuse it." Rebecca looked at him steadily. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." He gave his testimony to Cade that afternoon. It was comprehensive, specific, and consistent with everything they already had. When Cade finished taking it down, he looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who has just heard the piece that makes a complex puzzle completely clear. "Mr. Cooper," Cade said, "did you, at any point, tell Thomas Whitaker that you had seen the letter?" Cooper was quiet for a moment. "But I think he suspected. He stopped giving me the correspondence to carry about 2 weeks after I saw it. Started using a different man," another pause. "And 3 days after he switched, my landlord told me my lease wasn't being renewed." The landlord was Whitaker's cousin. The room absorbed this quietly. "That's why you left," Oliver said. "I wasn't going to wait and see what came after the lease." Cooper met his eyes directly. "I had heard what happened in that barn in November." The hearing convened on a cold Tuesday morning, in a courthouse room that held perhaps 40 people and that held, on the morning of the 23rd, something considerably closer to 80. Because the news had traveled the county with the reliable efficiency of news that involves a man of established power facing formal accountability. The Hartley family was there, Samuel and Daniel's wife, who had dressed their children in their best and brought them because, as she told Rebecca the night before, she wanted them to see what it looked like when someone fought and won. The Moores were there. The widow Saunders had been brought in a hired carriage by Rebecca herself, who had collected her at dawn and settled her into the best seat in the courthouse, with the particular tender briskness of someone managing a beloved, formidable elder. There were other faces Oliver didn't recognize: farmers, tradespeople, Women from town who had come, because the story had moved through the county the way real stories moved. Person to person. Gathering weight and detail. Until it was no longer just about a land manager and stolen lease payments, but about something larger. About what happened when people who were supposed to protect you didn't. About what happened when one person decided not to stop. Thomas Whitaker sat at the respondent's table with Briggs beside him, and his face was arranged in the pleasant, composed expression Oliver had seen on it 100 times. But his hands were folded too carefully on the table. He was managing himself. Oliver recognized it because he had done it himself in difficult proceedings, the deliberate performance of calm by someone who was not calm. Whitaker did not look at Rebecca when she entered the room. He looked at Oliver once briefly, with an expression that Oliver could not entirely read, something between calculation and contempt, and then looked away. Rebecca took her seat beside Cade at the complainant's table and opened her satchel and arranged her documents with the same efficient, unhurried precision she brought to everything. She did not look at Whitaker at all. Morrison called the hearing to order. Cade presented the case with the same calm, thorough structure he had used in the office building, from the foundation of the survey discrepancy up through the redirected payments, the falsified county records, the Marsden account, and Eli Cooper's testimony, each piece connected to the next with the logical clarity of a man who had spent weeks understanding a complex scheme and had distilled it into the simplest possible sequence of cause and effect. Briggs objected 4 times. Morrison overruled 3 of them and sustained one on a technical point that didn't affect the substance of anything. When Cade finished, Morrison asked Whitaker's counsel if he wished to respond. Briggs spoke for 20 minutes. It was, Oliver thought, the 20 minutes of a man who knew the case was lost and was performing competence for the record. He questioned the chain of custody on the survey documents. He questioned Cooper's credibility. He suggested that Mrs. Caldwell's compilation of evidence was motivated by personal animus and grief rather than objective fact-finding, and used the word troubled twice, which was the same word Whitaker had used with Morrison 6 weeks ago. Morrison wrote it all down. His face gave nothing away. Then Morrison asked if Rebecca Caldwell wished to address the hearing. Cade had advised her not to. He had said her documentation spoke for itself, and that personal testimony from a widow in front of a county hearing risked being read as emotional rather than evidentiary, and that the strongest position was to let the papers do the talking. Rebecca had listened to this advice carefully and respectfully. And then she had stood up. She stood at the front of the room, and she looked at Morrison. And she said what she had to say with the same directness and the same precise, unornamented clarity that she had used in Oliver's sitting room, in the Hartley kitchen, in Morrison's office. She talked about her husband. She talked about the families. She had spent 2 years sitting with the fear of their faces when she arrived, the way they had stopped believing anyone was going to help them. The particular kind of exhaustion that settled into people who had been told repeatedly that their testimony didn't count and their experience didn't matter. She talked about what it had cost to build the case, the hours, the years, the particular loneliness of working in the dark towards something you were not certain would ever reach the light. She did not cry. She did not perform distress. But there was something in her voice, the quality of a thing said by someone who has held it for a very long time and is finally setting it down in the right place, that made the room go completely still. When she finished, Briggs started to rise. Morrison held up one hand without looking at him, and Briggs sat back down. Morrison looked at his notes. Then he looked at Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "the documentary evidence before this hearing establishes, to my satisfaction, a pattern of systematic misappropriation of lease payments, falsification of county survey records, and diversion of estate funds to a third-party account over a period of not less than 7 years. The physical evidence, corroborated by Mr. Garrett's certified survey findings, establishes that boundary markers were altered within the last 2 weeks, subsequent to the opening of this investigation." He paused. "I am prepared to issue findings today." Briggs was on his feet. "Your Honor, the respondent requests. The respondent will have the opportunity to respond to through the appropriate appellate channels." Morrison's voice did not change. "Mr. Whitaker, I am finding sufficient cause to refer this matter to the Circuit Court for formal criminal proceeding on charges of fraud, falsification of public records, and misappropriation of funds held in trust." I am additionally ordering the full restitution of all lease payments, established through testimony and documentation to have been received, but not recorded, to be made to the affected tenant families within 60 days of this ruling. He looked up from his papers for the first time. I am also forwarding a separate referral regarding Edward Marsden to the Richmond Circuit, given the evidence pertaining to the account held in his name. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Samuel Hartley made a sound. It was not loud and it was not dramatic. It was the sound of an old man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. His son's hand came down on his shoulder. His daughter-in-law pressed her face into her children's hair. Thomas Whitaker stood up. His pleasant expression had finally completely failed him. What was left underneath it was something smaller and tighter and meaner, the face of a man who had believed, for 7 years, that he had built something untouchable, confronting the reality that he had built it on the certainty that no one would ever look. Someone had looked. He was taken from the courthouse by the sheriff's deputy within the hour. Oliver found Rebecca outside in the cold air, standing away from the dispersed crowd with her satchel in her hand and her face turned slightly away from the road. He came to stand beside her without speaking. They were quiet together for a moment. "It's not finished," she said at last. "The circuit court. Marsden in Richmond." "I know, and Thomas." Her voice was very low. "There'll never be a proceeding for Thomas. What happened in that barn, it doesn't have a name in any county record." "No, he didn't soften it. But what he found is what made all of this possible. That's in the record now. Cade made certain of it. Morrison has it in his findings." A pause. "His name is in the official record of how this case was built." "That's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She turned to look at him. The winter light was thin and flat and honest, and in it she looked tired in the way that people look tired after they have done something enormous, and the adrenaline has left, and all that remains is the true shape of the effort. She also looked, Oliver thought, with a certainty he did not try to qualify like herself. More fully, more completely herself than he had seen her any point in the 11 days, since a servant had placed a plain white plate in front of him at a harvest gathering. "Cade says I should move the bakery into town," she said. "With the restitution from Whitaker, the Hartleys have capital again. Daniel is talking about investing in a proper building on the main road." "A proper operation," she paused. "Cade has opinions about commercial property." "Cade has opinions about everything," Oliver said. "That's why he's worth what I pay him." A trace of that almost smile. "I don't know how to be in a proper operation," she said. "I know how to bake out of a farmhouse kitchen for people who need feeding." "A proper operation is a farmhouse kitchen with more ovens and a door on the main road." He met her eye. "You know exactly how to do this." She looked at him steadily. "Oliver." Her voice carried the careful, deliberate quality of someone who has decided to say a thing that they have been deciding about for some time. "Whatever this is, what's been building since that night, I need you to know that I am not interested in being someone's story. Not the widow the landowner rescued, not the poor woman who got lucky. I know that. I need you to say it differently." He held her gaze. "You built the case," he said. "You identified the fraud, documented the scheme, assembled the witnesses, protected the evidence for 2 years on your own, with no resources and no standing and no one who believed you could do it. I walked into a room you had already built and I opened a door you had already found." He paused. "The only thing I provided that you didn't already have was a name people were required to pay attention to. That's a significant thing and I won't pretend it isn't. But it doesn't change whose work this was." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'm going to go tell the Hartleys." "I'll come with you." She almost smiled. This time it went further than almost. "I know," she said. 6 months later, the Caldwell Bakery opened on the main road in town, in a building with 4 ovens and a painted sign and a door that anyone could walk through. The sign was Rebecca's idea, not the name on it, which Oliver had suggested, and which she had resisted for 2 full weeks before conceding was practical. But the fact that it had a sign at all, that it was a thing that could be seen and named, and walked into by any person in the county regardless of whether they had something to offer in return. The opening day, Oliver arrived in the early afternoon, after the morning rush had settled. He came through the door without announcement, the way he had been coming and going from Rebecca's life for 6 months without ceremony. without the particular performance that his name and his station historically required. The bakery smelled like warm sugar and wood smoke and something spiced that he could not entirely identify but that registered somewhere specific and undefended in his chest. Rebecca was behind the counter. She looked up when he came in and something in her face did what it always did when he arrived, that slight easing, that warmth that she no longer worked quite as hard to manage. "You're late," she said. "I had a letter from Cade. The Richmond Circuit has set a date for Marsden." She went still. "When?" "February. He expects a conviction within 3 days of the hearing." Oliver set the letter on the counter between them. "It's over, Rebecca. All of it. The last piece of it." She read the letter. Her hands were steady on the paper. When she finished, she set it down carefully, the way a person sets down something fragile that has just been confirmed as real. Someone came through the door behind Oliver, a woman with two sleigh case with the wide display kid eyes, Denpole entering a duplex for the first time. Rebecca straightened. Her voice shifted into the warm, efficient register of a woman at work. "What can I get for you?" Oliver stepped aside. He watched her move through the familiar rhythm of her work, the practiced efficiency, the particular attentiveness she gave every person who walked through her door, the way she handed a biscuit to the smaller child without being asked and without making a production of it. He waited until the family had gone. Rebecca came back around the counter and stood in front of him, close enough that the space between them was the kind of space that had a question in it. "February," she said. "February," he confirmed. She looked at him with the direct, clear, entirely unguarded gaze that she had been learning over 6 months to let him see without flinching. "Then I would like to discuss," she said carefully, "what comes after February." Oliver looked at her. "I've been thinking about that since November," he said. "Since a servant put a plain white plate in front of me at a harvest gathering, and I sat down across from the most formidable person I had ever met in my life, and she told me to start there." He paused. "I have a great many thoughts about what comes after February." She held to eye, she said. 3 weeks later, when the next harvest gathering at Hartwell Hall came around, and the long tables were laid, and the county's families arrived in their best, and a servant placed a plate before Oliver Kingsley with a small, imperfect, honest apple tart on it, he took one bite and went still, the way he always went still, the way he had gone still the first time. Up. Not at the room. Not at the guests. At the woman standing beside him, who had not been hidden in the shadows this time, who had not been standing in the space where candlelight thinned out and visibility ended, but was seated at the table to his right, the place that people occupied when they belonged there. "Who made this?" He asked the room the way he had asked it a year ago, but this time he was already smiling, and the room already knew the answer. Every person at the table answered at once, "Mrs. Rebecca Caldwell." Oliver looked at her. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes, the eyes of a woman who had spent 2 years working in the dark toward something she was not certain would ever reach the light, and who had turned out to be right. He raised his glass, and the woman who had baked bread for families, who couldn't say her name, who had documented a 7-year crime by lamplight, with no resources and no standing, who had walked into a room of powerful people because she needed a reason for them to look, and made them one. That woman raised her glass in return, and smiled the full smile this time, without reservation, without hesitation, without anything held back. She had always been worth finding. She had always been worth knowing. She had always been, in every room she ever entered, exactly the most important person in it. The only thing that had changed was that now everyone in the county knew it too.